here's an animation I made earlier that looks something like this. What we're gonna do is we are going to replicate this motion here. It's based off of this sketch. The first thing we'll do is put the body, face, and the legs in one symbol by using cut frames. And then insert new symbol. We're gonna call this symbol body container. And let's make sure that type is set to graphic. Now we just paste frames and make sure we have more than enough frames by selecting some frame in the distant future. Let's say frame 120, and then press F5 to insert a frame. Let's go back to our main timeline and clean up this timeline. I'm gonna add another layer and then we'll delete the rest of the layers. Let's drag our body container onto the stage and then extend it to include as many frames as we need. Once again, let's do frame 120. I'm gonna select this frame and press F5. One last thing, I'm gonna double click back into our body container and hide the legs for now by selecting these two layers, right clicking, and selecting guide. What that does is once we're outside of this symbol, those legs no longer show up. They're only visible when we're editing body container. Now let's put this in another symbol by hitting F8, and we'll call this body container 2. Make sure that type is graphic, and then we'll hit OK. One last time, we'll go into body container 2 and make sure that we have enough frames inside of it by selecting frame 120 and hitting F5. Time to finally exit back to our main timeline and add some motion. Right now we have one keyframe on frame 1. Let's lift our body container 2 into the air. Then we'll tween it downward by inserting a keyframe at frame 13 and moving this symbol downward by holding shift and dragging. I'm gonna tweak this first keyframe by moving it back inside the stage like that. I just decided I don't really want him to fall from that high. So that's our two keyframes. I'm going to right click somewhere between these two keyframes, hit create classic tween, go to the properties panel, and change the ease to ease in quart. This is a quartic ease in. That's our falling motion. Then we'll add another keyframe at frame 30 and bring our body container 2 upward a bit. That's our guy springing back after landing. We'll add a classic tween and open up the easing editor to make this somewhat of an ease in out, where it's faster at the beginning compared to the end. Now, making sure we have the selection tool activated, we'll double click to go inside our body container 2, and we'll put some keyframes at the same points in time as the main timeline. So frame 13 and then frame 30. Let's rotate frame 1 so it's leaning forward a bit, and then frame 13 so it's leaning backward. Now if we select a span of frames like this, right click and create classic tween, we'll leave the first tween how it is as a linear ease, but we'll give the second tween an ease out back. If we open up the easing editor, we can see how it's a type of ease out that starts fast but then overshoots past 100% before finally returning to the final value. Now, if we double click back out to the main timeline and play what we have, we can now see that nice complexity that our nested graphics allow us. And if there's ever any popping that happens, just make sure that the transform point of your graphic is the same on all frames by double clicking it on each keyframe, and that your graphic is playing all its frames in sync with the outer timeline. So a keyframe on frame 1 will say frame 1. And a keyframe on frame 13 will have a graphic that's also playing frame 13. Okay, so we have our landing motion. Time to add the jump. So far, our main timeline has been where all the vertical motion's been happening. Let's keep it that way. Just like the sketch from earlier, we'll make our guy go up a bit by putting a keyframe on frame 45 and shifting our body container 2 up slightly. We'll create a classic tween and use the ease editor to give it an ease out that's slower at the start, so something that looks like this. Now it's time for our big anticipation. We'll put a keyframe at frame 55 and move our body container 2 downward a lot. We'll give this classic tween an ease that's once again an ease in out, but slow at the end. And I can choose from our custom tweens to reuse an easing that we made beforehand. So in this case, my ease 1. This ease is once again slow at the end. So this guy's really preparing for his big jump. That's the feeling we want to give. And then comes the top of the jump. Let's put a keyframe at frame 75 with our guy way up in the air. and give this classic tween an ease in out that's slow at the end. And I can once again reselect that custom ease. Because this ease in out is slow at the end, it's like he's really hanging in the air. Finally, our last keyframe on frame 90 brings him off the bottom edge of the screen. We'll give this tween a more familiar cubic ease in. That was a lot. But now look at what we've made. That's a hefty guy right there. Well done. Now we can spice up our motion and really give this guy a sense that he's pushing himself by adding more rotation inside body container 2. This time, our keyframes are not going to be in sync with the main timeline, so even though frame 45 is where our vertical movement is motionless, we're going to dive in and put a keyframe at frame 50 instead. We'll make our body container lean backward and give it a classic tween. And we'll choose from our existing custom tweens to get the ease in out that's slow at the start. Now we'll make a keyframe at frame 60 and lean our body container forward for that authentic pushing feeling. And this classic tween will have a good old quart ease in out. Finally, we'll put one last keyframe at frame 90 and lean this symbol backward. This tween is going to have no ease at all, and you'll see why, because we are done with this motion. Let's double click back to the main timeline and take a look at what we've made. You can see how the difference in timing and easing lets us fill in this slow part at frame 55. And the top of our peak, where Blocky is just hanging in the air, really emphasizes that final slow rotation we made. Picture yourself jumping across a chasm. Don't you want to throw your arms backward to give yourself that extra boost? Let's take Blocky out of his T-pose and give the arms some motion. I feel like this is such a good example of how nesting helps us, because we didn't have to do anything to keep the arms staying attached. And now we're free to rotate the arms however we want, with whatever timing we want. With the selection tool active, let's dive back inside body container, where everything has just been motionless so far. At the beginning, that's where Blocky's starting to fall, so we'll start with our arms pointing down. Then we'll keyframe the arms at frame 13. And why not click this button to lock all of the layers and then unlock the two arms. On this keyframe on frame 13, the arms are going to be pointing mostly up. Then we'll just hit Command A or Control A to select the two arms, since everything else is locked. We'll add a classic tween, but not give it an ease. This is the arms gradually rising as Blocky falls. Now we'll put a keyframe on frame 40 for these two arms, and we'll move them back down. This tween is going to have an ease out elastic. If we look at the graph, we can see how this ease is extremely useful, especially when you're layering it with some other motions, and I like to think of it as a fancier version of the back ease. Let's double click back out to the main timeline and see what those arms look like in context. In this case, we're making the arms suddenly flop down as Blocky hits the ground. You'll notice that the easing makes the speed of the arms discontinuous here. That's breaking the rule of smooth motion from chapter 1. But since it's a reaction to a collision happening, and since there's other movements going on at the same time, it's totally fine. Time to finish the rest of the arm motion. Let's find a keyframe where Blocky is unrotated and dive back inside body container. Then we'll keyframe the arms on frame 48. We're going to move these arms so they both point forward. It's like Blocky saying, hold up. We're going to give this tween the custom tween that's slow at the end. But these arms, depending on how you rotate them, might not be in the right direction. For example, if I rotate them a little bit further, you'll see that one of the arms goes in the opposite direction. And so to make sure that they're all going in the right direction, we'll select the tween and specify the rotation as counterclockwise. We're going to change this 1 to a 0 to specify that this means 0 full rotations. And we'll do the same thing with the other arm. Rotation is going to be counterclockwise, 0 full rotations. And that is going to ensure that the arms are rotating in the correct direction. Now for the throwing motion, where Blocky's thrusting his arms backward. We'll put a keyframe at frame 60, and we're going to rotate these arms backward. This arm, I'm going to move a bit so that it's still showing. I'm going to move the playhead backward, make sure these frames are selected, and give it a classic tween, with an ease in-out that's slow at the end. And specify the rotation as clockwise, 0 full revolutions. That's going to give a motion like this. Finally, the arms are going to make one last rotation as Blocky hangs in the air and relaxes his arms. We'll put a keyframe at frame 65 and swap each of the straight arms with a bent arm. We're going to flip this arm by going to Modify, Transform, Flip Horizontal. And that's to ensure that they're both drooping down like this. And I'm going to rotate the arms so they're a little bit higher. Now, if we try to tween them, you'll see how the transition isn't the smoothest. So like we learned before, we'll be careful to hide the switch from straight to bent during a fast motion. So I've undone that tween, and we'll put a keyframe at frame 85. Then we'll go back to the second to last keyframe, enable onion skin, and use that preview to approximate the halfway point between the first and second positions. And the same thing with this arm, we're going to try to approximate the halfway point. Then we'll press Command A or Control A to select these frames, give it a classic tween, and change the ease to an elastic ease out. Finally, we'll make the straight arms start to move by placing a keyframe right before the bent arms, and using our onion skin preview to bring the straight arms right up against the incoming bent arms. And then we'll give the preceding keyframe a tween that is cubic ease in. We are done with the arms. Let's double click back to the main timeline and admire what we've made. Look at that. All of this staggered motion really gives Blocky a feeling of weight. Now all he needs are some legs. Let's bring back the legs by choosing the selection tool and then diving back inside so we're editing body container. We'll select the leg layers and then uncheck the guide option. Now if we go back to the main timeline, we might notice something. First off, it doesn't really look right how the feet are sliding on the ground. We want the legs to move with Blocky while he's in the air, but stay attached to the floor when he's grounded. Somehow, we have to switch which graphic the legs belong to, first when he makes contact with the floor, and then a second time when he breaks contact with it. Here's how. Right now, we're in the main timeline. Let's make 2 new layers, and bring them below our body container 2. We'll add a keyframe to these 2 layers, and then we'll select body container 2 and go to Modify, Break Apart. Though I recommend Command B or Control B. We'll repeat this until the leg symbols actually show up, but no further. We'll make sure these 2 legs are selected, copy, and then undo how we broke it apart. Finally, use Command-Shift-V to paste these legs in place on the lower layer. If I lock this layer and hide it, you can see that these legs are now in our main timeline. I'm gonna cut this leg and use Command-Shift-V to paste it in place. So now these 2 legs are one on each layer. What we've done is we've grabbed the legs through all those layers of nesting and brought them onto the main timeline while still preserving their transformation. Now we can dive back inside body container, select frame 13 on the frames with the legs, and convert it to a keyframe. Then we'll do the same thing on frame 60, which is when Blocky leaves the ground. And then while making sure that these layers are unlocked, select these frames and remove their contents. We've made the legs disappear from body container and then reappear. If we go back to the main timeline to look at what we've done, we can see how we sort of transfer the legs from the innermost graphic to our main timeline. And then let's go to frame 60 and use the F7 key to place an empty keyframe for when the legs reappear inside body container. I'm going to go back to frame 13 and rotate these legs so it looks more like they're standing on the ground. And I'm going to move them backward a little bit. One issue right now is that if we try to tween these legs, or skew them through a tween, you can see the feet are still prone to sliding on the floor. I'm going to undo those keyframes because what we need to do instead is first move the transform point to the feet. I don't think it really matters where on the feet, but as long as we can make sure that transformations occur around the feet, that'll maintain the sense of attachment to the ground, which in this section is a lot more important than the attachment to the body. At this point, we're free to add whatever keyframing or tweening we decide looks right, just to try to match the motion of the body. It's literally impossible to match the motion exactly, since that motion was created with nesting that we can't replicate here. But as long as it's somewhat close, it should still work. And now that the nesting of the legs is all sorted out, we can dive back inside body container and tweak the mid-air legs to look more natural by swapping the straight legs for leg bent above. I've made the legs at the beginning move with a linear ease just to give the sense that they're floating freely. It's not super important that they transition perfectly to the standing legs, since there's such a big impact happening at that same time. But if it makes it easier, you can use onion skin to help you by enabling it while you're on the main timeline, and then diving back inside. Now, even if you disable it while you're inside, you'll still see that preview, and you can use that to help you judge where the legs should end up. And the same goes for when the dangling legs reappear. It's not super important that they transition seamlessly, but in this case, I've given them an elastic tween, since it layers pretty nicely with the rest of the motions that are happening at the same time. Lastly, you can unlock the rest of the layers in body container and add some eye motions. Now, there's so many motions going on at once that, in my opinion, you won't even need to smooth out these eye motions at all. And that's an advanced body movement. Hopefully this helps you use nesting and staggering in your own animations. I've now opened up a scene from BFB 16 that I personally worked on, and I think that it's got a body movement that has a bit of complexity to it.
Oh my snowstorm! Floor's actually struggling to do something! This I gotta see!
Spongie's the largest contestant to be eliminated by 7 times!
Good to know.
Now this part is just going to be me freely talking about what I'm observing here.
Wow.
In this case, this motion that Loser is making is kind of a combination of a lot of techniques. You can even see here on the main timeline, I've sort of left this symbol here with quite a bit of nesting as his legs are flopping around on their own. Look at how exaggerated these legs are here before they finally recoil and return back to their natural state. And that's an example of how I want to combine both the legs swinging forward with Loser flying through the air. And the part where this leg is reaching out like that, even though this frame is so exaggerated, just the fact that the general shape is more similar to the leg that comes right after it just makes it seem more continuous. And it's hard to notice at full speed that this leg has such an exaggerated transform applied to it. You can see on the timeline how I've transitioned from one symbol to another, just to help break this into small parts that are a lot easier to deal with. In this case, this symbol has just 2 layers to it, and that's because I've put everything that's not this other leg all in one symbol. And that's where all of this fancy swinging and elastic motion is happening. And then there's this third piece here, after Loser jumps into the air. And this is where the spinning happens. Once again, we're using nesting to our advantage, since the spinning happens in its own timeline. You can see that you can combine motion tweens and shape tweens freely. In this case, if I decide to hide all layers but one, you can see how one part is doing its own piece of the pie. It's its own piece of the puzzle. But this motion is made a lot easier to deal with just because we don't have to worry about the rest of Loser's body motion happening. We don't have to worry about Loser floating through the air. We're just dealing with this single motion here. So I've backed out back into the main timeline. And I've already used a combination of the spline tween and just usual motion tweens. I think this is somewhat of a sine wave kind of tween. That's the motion of Loser's body after flinging himself into the air. You can see how he sort of oscillates back and forth like that. Finally, after he finishes that spin, he's going to transition back into another symbol. Once he lands, this is a completely different symbol. And it's got its own tweens here. That in itself is made up of multiple parts. And see, we don't even have to worry about that vertical jump because in this symbol, we're just worrying about the turn that he makes here. And of course, I've used this existing flapping arm motion to sort of fill out the slowness that's happening here, or the staticness as his body is just staying in place. This leg is transitioning from a bent one into a straight one. I'm back on the main timeline now, and there's a shape tween over here. What is that shape tween? That is Loser's leg. Okay, that was not a very substantial shape tween. And then there's another jump, and finally, I believe this is a repeat of the same symbol as before. But you can see how we've combined a number of different symbols, both by nesting symbols, but also by switching from one to another across multiple frames. And that just helps our brain have to worry about less things at once. So anything that's happening here with these sort of extended arms, we don't have to worry about when we're editing this symbol here with the jump. These extended arms all happen within this one scope here. And then once we swap it with this symbol, we don't have to worry about these arms anymore. Now we're just dealing with the spin and the jump. And that is BFB episode 16, scene 10. That is Loser's jump as he's doing his little dance. That is all I have to say about that scene. Do you ever feel like you have this clear idea of a pose in your head, but when you go to animate it, it just doesn't come out right? Like when you're looking at the program, you feel like it's so clumsy having to drag all these little points and then position these symbols just right. I mean, I definitely feel like that all the time, which is why I'm with you in declaring that animating in symbols is hard. And that applies to full body movements more than anything. I think we've all seen a Flash animation where it's like you just look at it and you think, that looks stiff. That looks like it was made of pieces. I've definitely experienced that before, and it's like the whole point of puppet animation, which is to save time and energy. Like it's just gone out the window. And for sure, it's true you don't have to redraw every frame like you do in traditional animation, but now all this work has shown up in a different way. Now instead, there's a million assets that you have to rotate or move or otherwise tweak just to recreate the same natural feeling you would automatically get if you were just animated traditionally. So I've declared a problem, but there's got to be a solution. What if we considered the act of posing a character's assets to be the final stage of animating? With the amount of detail that you need to provide when you're posing these assets, in some ways it's got more in common with data entry than art. If you feel overwhelmed when you're just rotating an eyebrow and then you realize that there's the entire other body to bring to life, just know that you're not alone. There isn't a single landscape artist who starts off their piece by painting off every blade of grass. What we want to do is block out our motions before we go to pose the individual body parts, and how we do this is low tech. We can get the best of both worlds by drawing things on paper. If we made the asset posing the last step, well then we can leave most of the creativity to the step before it. That takes all the pressure off of us in terms of coming up with the expressions and on the character motives on the fly, when all we're trying to do is just make these shapes move in a polished way. Now, we don't have to choose between making an expressive animation and making a polished animation. It's easy to do without making this choice because I think that fiddling with all the vector shapes on the computer is a trap. If we remember what we originally came here to do, which is to make a cartoon, then drawing things out again is the obvious choice. In fact, I recommend not only planning out your movements on paper, but also just practicing how a character moves. You can see here I'm sketching out a bunch of different gestures. All of these gestures are things you could imagine a person doing in real life, just like we're practicing the way it might feel to draw it on a 2D sheet of paper. And that builds up habits that'll help us when we go to tinker with the 2D assets in Adobe Animate. To wrap this up, all I want to say is that when we don't have to worry about the anchor point of a movie clip or the easing of a tween, it frees up our brain to think, well, what does it actually feel like to push a boulder? How can I make the audience feel pain when my character gets their hand trapped in a door frame? I want you to be less stressed out by the complexity of Adobe Animate, and the freedom of drawing things on paper is how we get there. In fact, the more we practice drawing things on paper and drawing these gestures, the easier it gets to think, oh, curved line here, straight line here. Because whether we like it or not, there's a visual language we can benefit from becoming fluent in. If we want to convey where our character's center of mass is, or which arm they're putting their energy into, it really helps to practice communicating it in a drawing. Getting used to the feeling of translating real-life actions into 2D shapes on paper is going to help you at the same time to translate them into shapes on the screen.